Hi, everyone. Crista Cowan here with another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. It is time for the second episode in our series about storytelling. And I have a very special guest joining me today. Jennifer Utley has been with Ancestry for more than 25 years. In fact, she's employee number one here at the company. And she is in charge of story producing here at Ancestry. So let me go ahead and bring her on, and then you can listen in on our conversation. Let's see here. We're going to pull her on. There you are. Hi, Jen.
Hi, Krista.
So, Jen, tell us a little bit about what a story producer does at Ancestry.
Well, first of all, I'm the lucky person who gets to sit next to the Barefoot Genealogist during work hours.
It's true.
So that's kind of nice. I get to ask her all my questions as we go. So I feel like I've got an expert next to me. So I am the executive story producer at Ancestry. That means my team goes in and we look at different people's family trees. It can be reporters, it can be celebrities, it can be people who are going to be on our different television shows. And we look in every tree and we look to see what are the best stories we can tell in those trees. And the one thing we've learned throughout the years is there's a story in everybody's family tree. So in fact, there's more than one. So if you haven't found it, you haven't been looking hard enough, because our ancestors are fascinating and they lived through interesting times and they made decisions that lead to us today. So I'm always encouraging everyone, go to look and find those stories in your family tree.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So when you're looking to tell a story, there are a few things you have to take into consideration. One of the primary things that you need to consider is how much time you have to tell that story. So can you just give us some examples of the various formats and timeframes that you have to work with?
Sure. So if we're doing something like Who Do You Think You Are? That's 42 minutes of primetime television. And that means that we have to come up with enough story. And in fact, when we look at it, we're looking for the records that tell the story, but they can only tell this much of the story at a time. Because if I find one like a biographical sketch that tells me the whole story, then I've got 5 minutes of television. So one of the things I need is all the different records that tell just a little part of the story. So for example, when we did Kelly Clarkson's tree on Who Do You Think You Are? We had to find, we found that her great-great-great-grandfather, whoever, how many greats, he enlisted in the Union Army, and then he fought at the Battle of Decatur, and he was captured a prisoner of war, and he escaped, and then he was shot by friendly fire, and then he went home and he became a politician, and he campaigned on a platform of women's rights and prohibition, right? Like if you find that in a obituary, that's great. You find a lot of story. But when we find it, we have to find all the different little records that tell us the little pieces of the story, so that the people can go, each of the celebrities get to go on a journey where they uncover each one of those details. So to put together something like a 42 minutes of television, it can take us 1,000 hours of research to find all those little different pieces. So,
well, and sometimes you find the end at the beginning, and
right.
That's not necessarily the order you tell the story in either.
That's right. You have to find the best way of telling the story, and you also have to appreciate the audience you're telling it to. What's their attention span like? What do they want to hear about? Like, especially if you're telling stories to your family, like maybe you don't have 42 minutes to tell their story. You've got to figure out how to tell the story in a much smaller segment of time. So sometimes all we have are 5-minute segments, which are what we do a lot of. Those are a lot of the reporters we are on television for. And when we do those, that will take us about 2 weeks. And it also means you find 2 or 3 records about a single character, and you tell that one character's story arc, because you don't want to get too complicated. Even if you're a big fan of Who Do You Think You Are? You'll notice we don't jump around the tree a lot, because you'll lose your audience. They'll get lost in the tree.
Yeah, which actually brings up a really good point, because I think a couple of our audience members here, after my last video introducing this concept of storytelling, asked that very question, right? How do you give people context and help them understand how they're related to the hero of the story, and how do you not include so many people that they do get lost? So how do you simplify stories, whether it's to tell a 42-minute story arc or to tell a 5-minute story arc?
Well, each person, they're not just one-dimensional. There's lots of different things to find. So you bring in the historical context, but at the same time, you've got to decide, do I have enough time to unpack this complicated story? So there's some stories that we would never consider in a 5-minute segment, but there are some stories like the journey from the old world to the new world, getting on a ship, leaving the people behind, seeing the passenger list. What are they bringing with you? Where do they go to? What kind of life do they build for themselves on the other side? You can do that in 5 minutes, but there are some stories that are so complicated that I wouldn't recommend trying to tell them really quickly, or people can get lost in the details.
Yeah, for sure. So good advice for everyone is think about your audience and also think about where you're telling that story. If I'm sitting, on my nephew's bed as I'm putting him to bed at night, and I've got my iPad so I can show him records, and I maybe have 15 or 20 minutes of his attention because he's trying to avoid going to sleep. That's going to be a different story that I'm going to tell when I've got a 5-minute window at the dinner table before everybody scatters and I don't have any visual aids. And so the place you're telling that story, think about where you want to share it, because that's going to determine how you craft the story for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't have time to tell the whole story of the war of regulation that lots of people are like, I don't know what that is.
Right.
A lot of you will know what that is, but that's hard to condense down into 2 minutes and to explain all the different nuances of what's going on.
Yeah, I love that. You mentioned earlier that every family has a story, you just have to dig. And one of the viewer questions that came in was from Lorna, and she said her family were all farmers as far back as she can find, and she doesn't feel like that's too terribly interesting. So how would somebody like that find a story to tell?
Well, I think that's part of when you learn about the context and you learn about the history of the times. Like yes, your people were farmers, but what were they farming? And what did that mean to their local economy? And also what was going on in the politics in the area that they might have gotten, a little heated over and maybe got involved in. So it's interesting to go in and look at those different things, because they're not living by themselves in this, out isolated. Well, I guess they are. And then that's another story you can look at too. But you just look at all the different aspects that got them where they were there, and then the historical context, and even things as easy as like, what was the weather like, can turn into a story, because it was a different thing to live in this country. I mean, behind me, it's there's a blizzard behind me going on right now. We're nice and warm here, but your ancestors, they weren't in the same kind of position we were in. So to try and understand and put yourself in their shoes. And also when you're looking at the family tree, do the math, like figure out how people were related to each other, who was older than the others. Look at all those different things, because they aren't alone either. They have relationships with other people. So to understand, like, look at it and say, like, they lost all their brothers when they were quite young, right? So you look at not just the single person, but you look at all the other people in the timeline. And that's, putting together timelines is what can really help you to understand how those things are happening. Like the death of a parent's a big deal. Where did that occur in their life?
Yeah, you've given us some really good suggestions just packed right there in that comment. The idea that you've got a timeline that you can put together. Oftentimes I see a lot of people building their family trees just going from, child to parent to parent to parent, but make sure you identify all the siblings in a family. Are there aunts and uncles and cousins who live nearby? Look at things like almanacs so that you understand what the weather was like at the time. Look at things like maps so that you can understand, what was the land like that they were farming? Was it hilly? Was there an easy water source? What was the soil like? Look at how far apart people's farms were. The census, you read through the census and sometimes it's easy to think, oh, they live next door to so-and-so, but next door in some context, maybe 7 miles away. And, they may live so far from town that they can only go in once a month for supplies. And there are, even among farmers and ranchers and people who lead what we may consider kind of boring lives, there are still for sure stories to tell there.
Right. And I'd also recommend is, as you're crafting your story, every story needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So see if you can identify where those places are and what's the central conflict of their lives. So these are just normal storytelling, things that we use to figure that out, but beginning, middle, and end will help your storytelling.
Yeah, for sure. So David says he can prove, for example, that someone immigrated by using a passenger list, using a record and showing that record as he's telling that story. But he has no way to know why somebody immigrated. And it seems like telling a really good story would require some kind of character motivation. So his question is, does he just make something up, or does he let the listener speculate for themselves? How do you handle that when you're crafting a story?
That's really interesting. And one of the things we love is when we find any kind of record that has an ancestor's words in it, because then you learn what those motivations are, but you don't have those for all the ancestors, right? So sometimes you have to piece that together too. Now, you can look at the broad strokes, right? The big historical context, which will usually be the answer. But, people are individuals and they'll tend to do things their own way. So you can't rely on that. But I think when you're telling the story, give your audience, your listener, whoever that is, some of that context so that they can understand that that is a likely thing, and also have them reach that conclusion too. So, you have to be careful, because we can't always decide this is exactly why my people came here and why they made these decisions. But you can look at some generalities that will help bring more color to their story.
So you mentioned color to the story, right? So how do you add enough details to enhance the telling of the story without overloading people with too many details? And what kinds of details might you look? You mentioned weather earlier. Are there other things in telling a story that you might look to include?
Well, and if you think about storytelling in general, if you're writing a story, you get to pick your character and where they're at and what the conflict is. But when you're looking at family history, you have to then go and find out what those things are. Who is your character? Where did they live? You don't get to pick the setting, so you better learn everything about that setting that you can, because you don't get to pick it. So you need to know all the details, because there might be a really cool detail in there that you've overlooked. So all those principal storytelling aspects that we have, you have to make the most of them, because you don't get to make it up. You want it to be truthful. And then how do you choose the ones? Once again, I would always be very mindful of your audience.
Yeah.
How sophisticated is it? How much time do they have? Because the last thing we want to do is bore them with, we want them to ask us to tell more stories, right?
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah.
we're really, when we're sharing our family history, especially with our families, we want them to do that. So it is tricky. I would always err, though, on going a little bit shorter and leave them wanting more.
For sure. Yeah, really good advice. It's interesting because I've just been kind of thinking as you've been talking about my nephews, for example. Like, I have one nephew who is kind of a clothes horse. Like, he's always shopping the outlet malls and looking for the latest pair of shoes, and he's very fashion conscious. And so for him, if I was telling him a story, I might include details about how uncomfortable the shoes were that they were wearing, or what the pants looked like. And so I'd have to go find those details in order to share them with him and make them, time and place appropriate for the story, even if I didn't have specific details for my specific ancestor. Another one of my nephews is very engineering minded, and he's very into how things work. And so for him, if I was telling a story about our great grandfather, as a farmer, I might explain the farming implements that he had to work with at that time and how that compares to today. So really good advice to think about your audience and then go looking for details to include that will draw them into the story for sure.
Well, and even ask them what they're interested in. Like, anytime if we're doing who do you think you are, or we're, doing a reveal with a different cast member or whatever, every single one of these people, we ask them, what do you know already, and what are you hoping to learn? Like, we'd love to know what it is, because sometimes you'll be surprised at how often you can deliver a story that they can make a real connection like that, because that also gets them thinking about, what do I want to learn about my ancestors?
Right.
So that kind of primes the pump for you in multiple ways.
Love it. Well, we are going to take your advice and end with people wanting more.
Okay.
Before we do, however, let me just ask you the question that I ask all of my guests, though not quite framed this way. Other than sitting next to me, what's your favorite thing about working here?
I love that my job is never the same. That I'm learning about things all the time. In fact, I keep notes on my phone of the thing that I learned about this week, because when it comes to the history of mankind, you're not going to know it all, right? And the cool thing is I get to work with really cool experts at ProGen and people like you and my other coworkers that help me learn those things. So I think other than the awesome people I work with, it's what I learn about all the time, because it's never the same job. It's always changing.
So true. Well said. Thank you so much for joining me, Jen. I appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Well, that was Jennifer Utley, the lead story producer here at Ancestry. In 2 weeks, I will be back with Lisa Elzy, who is on Jen's team and has her own unique lens through which she looks at storytelling. If you have additional questions about how to find and tell stories in your family history, please leave them here in the comments on the YouTube video, and we will see if we can't work that into my conversation with Lisa in 2 weeks. Until next time, I'm Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.